Our final speaker is Ruth Morgan. Like Laura, Ruth is an historian of science as it bears on natural as well as urban environments. As a lead author on the issue of water in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, her historical expertise informs current policy debates. Her presentation today frames environmental degradation through the lens of violence and presents a challenge to change its legacies through climate justice. Ruth.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me today, Carolyn. And it's great to see the network going from strength to strength. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose unceded lands we gathered today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present for caring for this beautiful country for generations. And I think in my paper today, we might see some surprising links with Anna's paper in terms of politics of inaction and the violence that arises from those circumstances. By the late 1980s, climate change was already understood by contemporaries as a global issue, that is, a common concern of humankind, according to the United Nations. Yet this framing was a relatively recent development. It built on foundations laid in the 19th century. Most Western geographers and scientists, though, only came to define and measure climate in such global and dynamic terms after the dawn of the atomic age. Having long understood climate as a local phenomenon, Western scientists were not convinced that humanity could induce climate change until the 1960s. By virtue of such a global scale of analysis, this framing of climate would always be remote from direct human experience and require scientific mediation. Recognising that anthropogenic climate change could unfold within the space of a generation or two eventually arose from the intersection of atomic science, ecological thought, and Cold War internationalism. New ways of thinking about the environment in planetary terms, as earthly, likewise afforded novel ways of thinking about the relationships between humans, beyond race and nation, and between humans and the planet, as either passengers or pilots of spaceship Earth. For many governments and observers in the South, the global framing of climate change was historically cause for suspicion. This outlook not only reflected their prioritisation of local problems and aspirations, but also their capacity to participate in this global Western science. Most, if not all, of the theoretical research on climate change to the early 1990s had been undertaken in the industrialised nations of the North, especially the United States, the Soviet Union, Sweden, West Germany, and even Australia. The international scientific networks to monitor environmental change similarly favoured those nations, although satellite technology from the 1970s somewhat improved the balance, with caveats, of course. Facilitating greater involvement of scientists from the developing world in international science, particularly in the IPCC, which Carolyn has mentioned, has gone a long way to improve their scholarly representation. It also had perhaps even more importantly significant implications for climate knowledge, and thus for climate negotiations more broadly. Since the 1970s, questions from the South as to the assumptions and results of global, ostensibly neutral scientific analysis have invited closer scrutiny of the knowledge geopolitics of climate science and allied fields. The United Nations, with its attendant agencies, was just one of the post-war international institutions that provided a forum to explore, articulate, and reinforce emerging global outlooks. Although the Cold War loomed large over those organisations, their international nature reflected a renewed faith in the importance of cooperation between nations to ensure peace, prosperity, and progress for all peoples. Rhetorically anyway. Non-governmental organisations such as the International Council of Scientific Unions were similarly instrumental, encouraging collaboration and knowledge exchange in the seemingly apolitical and neutral realm of science. According to the proponents of such post-war internationalism, this cooperation could not be left to chance or to individual governments. It required the expert, rational and objective guidance of the technocracies that would oversee those international institutions, such as the UN and the World Meteorological Organization. The engagement of these international institutions in emerging concerns about the environment from the late 1960s encouraged the pursuit of atmospheric diplomacy through multilateral means. the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits nuclear testing in the atmosphere, as well as outer space and the oceans, not underground though, suggested that other forms of air pollution could too be the subject of such an international regime. The first international conference on the environment, organised under the auspices of the UN General Assembly, the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, 1972, arose in part from Swedish concerns about acid rain, which emanated largely from the UK and West Germany. Since the turn of the 20th century, air pollution had become understood as a local problem requiring local solutions, which post-war publics increasingly expected their governments to address. But aside from the 1941 Trail smelter case in North America, pursuing pollution abatement across national borders had few international precedents until the 1970s. Thanks, though, to the newly articulated principles of the 1972 Stockholm Declaration, environmental concern and scientific expertise could eventually combine to enable European and North American governments to negotiate an international agreement to limit the emission of pollutants responsible for acid rain. And so when ozone-depleting substances became recognised as a risk to human health during the 1970s, an even larger group of nations pursued a similar approach to their monitoring and restriction, which became something of a template for negotiating the international regime to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. Whether sulphur dioxide, ozone-depleting substances, or greenhouse gases, diplomatic efforts to negotiate the reduction of atmospheric emissions have all encountered, though, the same challenge of reconciling human and environmental benefit, often remote, both in geographic and temporal terms, with the fear of economic disadvantage under conditions of scientific uncertainty. Framed as such, this challenge has been among the defining features of climate diplomacy since its inception. The largest polluters, historically the industrialised nations, are unlikely to bear the worst consequences of their own emissions. Establishing the IPCC as a means to diminish uncertainty and to improve the precision of climate prediction hasn't yet overcome the influence on the negotiations of this uneven distribution of climate emissions and impacts. The dual emergence in the late 1980s of climate change as an object of international diplomacy and liberal or market environmentalism as the new means of addressing environmental challenges really helped cement the market as the means to protect economic growth in the ensuing negotiations. And since the late 1980s, states have continued to pursue fossil-fuelled economic growth and national development in the face of mounting scientific evidence of the need to abate their total greenhouse gas emissions. Only those states, though, that can least afford this outlook have seen the situation differently and have pressed their case in existential terms. Low-lying island nations have been especially vigilant. Since the late 1980s, their unique vulnerability to rising sea levels and severe weather events has encouraged these nations to intervene in negotiations to strengthen the ambitions of the less vulnerable. And they have always emphasised the existential threat that they face. In the wake of September 11 and the Bush administration's withdrawal of the United States from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001, global security became a watchword to signal the importance and urgency of sustaining commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These appeals to multilateralism gave way then to declarations of a climate crisis a decade later, as the need arose to negotiate a successor to Kyoto. And what these declarations described was less a crisis of climate change per se, although I'm sure the low-lying island nations saw things differently, but more a crisis of climate diplomacy, that the prevailing approach wasn't going to be averting dangerous interference with the climate system. And if that was the case, then what would? In the negotiations to limit the impacts of present and future climate change, history has weighed heavily on the dynamics of international climate diplomacy. Under the terms of the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, parties have common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities to address climate change. Led by the large industrialising nations of China, India and Brazil, the South has consistently argued that the problem of climate change is the consequence of the industrialisation of the North. Having accrued the benefits of this fossil-fuelled process, the South argues, it's incumbent upon those wealthy nations to reduce their emissions first and allow other nations to develop accordingly. That greenhouse gas emissions linger in the atmosphere for decades was all the more reason for the industrialised nations to take the lead, despite what Australia's delegation has been saying in Bonn recently. Grounded in the Cold War politics of decolonisation and development, the South's aspirations for independence and development sovereignty have long been non-negotiable in the climate regime. Delegations from the South hold firm to this position throughout the negotiations of the Climate Convention and the subsequent Kyoto Protocol, such that only industrialised countries bore commitments to reduce their emissions. The means of implementing such mitigation occupied negotiators throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, while fossil fuel interests, as we know, have continued to seek to derail this climate regime entirely. I argue that international approaches to climate change have arisen from and been sustained by the historical and ongoing negotiation of science, global change and environmental justice. Negotiation in this sense extends beyond the formal scientific and political diplomacy of the climate order that has unfolded since Malta advocated in 1988 in the UN General Assembly for the recognition of climate change as a common concern of humankind. It was their intervention that prompted member states to embark on deliberations for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Negotiation frames that form of climate diplomacy much more broadly, as the international response to a longer history of scientific efforts to comprehend the climate as a planetary system, which resonated first with the architects of post-war and Cold War internationalism. And eventually, this global and dynamic climate provided the rationale for a global scale agreement between governments to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, which is the objective of the Framework Convention. This broader temporal conceptualisation of negotiation allows them for a closer scrutiny of both the contingent and contested ways this scientifically framed global climate was cultivated and its encounters with the structures and relationships of the international system. As both real and represented, this global framing of the climate has enabled diplomats, scientists, Indigenous peoples, corporations, environmentalists, and many more to strategically invoke and enrol climate change for different and sometimes competing ends, in ways similar to the uses of Antarctica, outer space, and the ocean. Negotiations of the international climate regime have since the late 1980s been entangled in rival market and justice globalisms, and later in the assertion of global Indigenism. And drawing on Manfred Steger's work, proponents of these ideologies seek to endow globalisation with their preferred norms, meanings, and values, which is what I mean by globalism. Each of these global imaginaries have found expression in the climate regime, and foregrounding them shines a light on how claims about climate and climate change are very often politics by other means. As historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has put it, quote, "We can never compose our planetary collectivity by ignoring the intensely politicised and necessarily fragmented domain of the global that understandably converts scientists' statements about humans as the cause of climate change into a charged discussion about moral responsibility and culpability," end quote. The material world continues to shape the climate regime nevertheless, and seasonal conditions or extreme weather events such as droughts, floods and cyclones have long provided anchors for arguments about the nature and rate of global climate change, and they too thus participate in the negotiations of the climate order. For much of the history of the UN climate regime, such variability and change has been largely mediated through the lens of Western science, with the critical insights of traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge gaining only belated recognition in climate negotiations. The 2000 Declaration of Indigenous Peoples represented a turning point for these competing globalisms of market and justice globalism and global Indigenism. This declaration had arisen from the first International Forum on Indigenous Peoples on Climate Change, which had gathered delegates from Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa and Oceania to coincide with climate negotiations underway in Lyon in France. As the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does not refer to Indigenous peoples, the declaration gestured to other international conventions that did, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the International Labour Organization. The 2000 Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples called for the Framework Convention to formally recognise Indigenous peoples and their organisations in their processes at the upcoming climate conference at The Hague. This recommendation echoed a similar call made in 1998 in the Albuquerque Declaration, which was prepared by Indigenous peoples from across North America and presented to negotiators in Buenos Aires in 1998. The experiences of Indigenous peoples and local people in southern countries were also at the forefront of the climate justice meeting that CorpWatch organised at The Hague for the climate conference in late 2000. There's so many conferences and meetings. Anyway, in response to this growing Indigenous presence, the Framework Convention recognised the Indigenous peoples' organisations as an official constituency in 2001, which allowed them to have speaking rights and office space, which is significant in the circumstances. 2 years later, in 2002, a coalition of organisations came together as the International Climate Justice Network at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg. This intervention reflected a wider fragmentation among the environmental organisations that had been engaged in the climate regime since the early 90s. Assembled under the umbrella network of the Climate Action Network, the rapidly expanding number of organisations introduced a growing array of perspectives and priorities to the coalition. Those groups oriented against globalisation and liberal environmentalism became increasingly disillusioned with the old guard of environmental organisations, such as the Environmental Defence Fund, which had supported carbon trading as a politically expedient approach to emissions reduction. The anti-globalisation movement, more broadly, had become engaged in the issue of climate change in response to the G8 agenda that the UK government and later Germany promoted in the mid-2000s. At the 2007 climate conference in Bali, climate justice groups finally parted ways with the Climate Action Network, forming Climate Justice Now and Climate Justice Action. Aligning with a wider network of environmental justice organisations, these groups were focused on the intersections of climate change with issues of social, ecological and gender justice and the protection of livelihoods and the environment. Increasingly, the climate justice movement is framing their cause in terms of violence, climate violence. Since the late 1980s at least, climate change has been associated with conflict and violence in terms of its potential implications to resource scarcity and forced migration, particularly in the south. Although the scholarship on the correlation between climate change and conflict is patchy and suspect, advocates for climate action hoped to leverage northern anxieties to curb their emissions and avoid dangerous consequences of climate change. And those dangerous consequences are material too in other ways, through those rising frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and rising sea levels. But for the climate justice movement, climate violence is the violence not from below, but from above. As Rebecca Solnit put it in a 2014 op-ed, quote, "Climate change is global-scale violence against places and species, as well as against human beings. Once we call it by name, we can start having a real conversation about our priorities and values," end quote. Climate violence derives from Johan Galtung's 1969 formulation of structural violence, where violence hinges on the degree to which a given form of injury or suffering is avoidable. When harm is avoidable, violence is present. Conversely, when the actual is unavoidable, then violence is not present. As sociologist Dennis Sorona argues, quote, "The causes and consequences of climate change, who is responsible, who gets hurt, are now sufficiently understood. To disregard that knowledge or to fail to respond adequately must be classed as intentional behaviour," end quote. While there is climate violence that arises from acts of commission, of actively adding to the problem, there are also acts of omission. What collective institutions and those wielding power are systematically failing to do in order to prevent it or mitigate its effects. The history of international negotiations to curb climate change can very easily be understood in this light, as a decades-long act of omission, of failing to prevent dangerous climate change, of contributing to its slow violence, to borrow from Rob Nixon. But I think blaming the negotiations for failure distracts us from those with the power to arrest acts of commission, nation-states and corporations. It's tempting to assume that the global environment has a global government with a global constituency, that can respond directly to the insights of global science. The global climate that climate science comprehends is instead subject to international treaties and the actions of states. Those treaties have been negotiated through the United Nations and its agencies by nation states with their own constituents. Those constituents reside in different parts of the world that are more or less vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Some have benefited from the historical processes that produce those effects, while many more have not. Since the parties to the Framework Convention signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, the so-called firewall between the developed and developing nations has become less of a defining feature of climate diplomacy. Under the terms of the Kyoto Protocol, only 37 industrialised nations were obliged to reduce their emissions by an average of 5% relative to 1990 levels, which became just one of many issues that attracted criticism to that regime. It reached new heights in the aftermath of the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference, when observers feared that the past 2 decades of climate diplomacy would amount to naught. But under the terms of the Paris Agreement, all countries now have international legal obligations to develop, implement, and regularly strengthen their mitigation actions to collectively limit the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to limit that increase to 1.5 degrees, and that was fought for by the island nations. The Paris system encourages nations to make ambitious pledges commensurate with their common but differentiated responsibilities. With the first 5-year global stocktake concluding in 2023, the time will soon come to take the temperature on this version of international climate diplomacy. That is, to determine whether the parties to the Paris Agreement, nation states, continue to commit climate violence. Thank you.